Hi. So Steve Mould released a new video explaining the chain fountain again. If you don't know, Steve and I released a video each at the same time, link in the description, disagreeing on why the effect happens. I had everyone in my pocket with my reasoning. Even Derek of Veritasium was almost convinced by me. But then, Steve's new video, link in the description, made me lose everyone, even Derek of Veritasium. I watched Steve's video and I thought, damn, I was wrong about this. But then I quickly realized I was just mesmerized with his blue eyes and soothing voice. He was just so convincing in his video, and he would have won our bet of 10,000 Canadian cents if he hadn't shot himself in the foot throughout his video left and right. Sorry Steve, I'm just hyping up the drama throughout the video for science, you know. Left and right! What I like about this debate though is that it got many of you involved and we received a ton of great thoughts and experiments. So it's a win for science and hopefully eventually for me. Okay, let me give you a quick history. For more details you can watch our earlier videos, but this is a chain fountain or mold effect. The chain rising above the lip of the container before falling. To be on the same page with Steve, the effect must be able to start growing on its own. Per my view, because acceleration and force can't be infinite, a time period is needed for the chain to start from stationary to a certain speed and another time period for that speed to change from positive to negative. As the chain is speeding up falling, in a certain period of time, the chain would have to travel higher and higher. One note though that becomes important later, the chain will shoot out in a direction that it can, in average, consistently escape from. For example, in my previous video, you saw in my 2D floor test that the chain shoots away from the pile against the direction I'm pulling. And here, I place the pile sideways, and you see the chain only shoots sideways. Steve, on the other hand, reasons based on the Cambridge University paper that it is not enough for the chain to rise without an additional force that comes from the surface the chain is sitting on. Based on Steve and the paper, a chain or a string in general that has a limited bend radius exhibits a lever-like behavior where the chain pulls up on one side, the other side pushes against the surface, and so the surface pushes back, which is the force needed to help raise the chain. Now there's a common ground between both of us, like Steve mentioned in his video.
A chain will flow through the shape that you give it.
Well, not always.
And that shape would be maintained in the absence of gravity.
Not exactly true.
In the presence of gravity, the shape that you give the chain collapses over time.
I don't agree with that yet. Sounds like a hypothesis.
As I pull the chain around, it moves through the shape that I give it. Actually, the shape does collapse a little bit, presumably because of friction in this case, as opposed to gravity.
Yeah, I agree with that.
This textbook from 1860 talks about chains maintaining their shape when flowing in steady state.
Oh yeah? As if you read the book and understood all of it. Have you? Okay, the way I understand Steve's argument is a chain tends to travel through the same path in 3D space in steady state, as in traveling in constant speed and not losing energy due to things like friction or gaining energy by some pulling force. In the presence of uniform forces like gravity, the chain still holds its shape. It would just travel as one big body in a certain direction. So, is the chain fountain system in such a steady state? No! At the beginning, it is accelerating, and that's when the fountain is growing. And even when it reaches a constant speed, it is constantly being pulled by gravity on one side and is speeding up from zero. Although the chain still tries to travel through the same path where it can. Also, I've mentioned it before and mention it again. Why does the chain even reach a constant speed? If you're thinking terminal velocity is the cause, that's not the case. Terminal velocity happens when the force of gravity on an object traveling through a fluid becomes equal to the force of friction from that fluid against the motion of the object. and the speed becomes constant. For that, a dense object like a chain must go very fast, dropping from very high. For the human body, it is around 200 kilometers an hour. The chain reaches a puny, slow, constant velocity in just a meter, so it's not terminal velocity. Like I said, there is clearly a force opposing the force of gravity, and I argued that force is the sum of forces opposing the acceleration of the chain from 0 to speed, and another one opposing the change of speed from positive to negative. Steve hasn't provided any other reason for this constant speed, like it's nothing. But in my opinion, that's the whole point. Existence of such force indicates a limited acceleration and so a finite time period needed for the chain to loop around. But never mind these, let's do some experiments, or rather, rewatch some experiments, since Steve already did enough in his video, and I'll tell you why he's shooting his own foot left and right. He argues that my very convincing test of pulling the chain over ground, creating the effect, is not convincing at all. I did this test to specifically show that the chain doesn't need to push against the surface to create the effect. To eliminate factors like gravity and the supposed lever effect, I spaced out the chain in the pile on the ground and pulled the chain from one side to create the effect. But he said,
the fountain doesn't actually grow. It does appear to grow in height, but that's just because the top of the pile is receding in this direction. If you look at the peak of the fountain, it doesn't get any higher. It actually moves down slightly, probably due to friction.
oh really? So for the mold effect, the chain has to rise and stay in the same height? So you're claiming if we have, say, a 2-meter pile and the chain drops there, as the chain goes and the top of the pile recedes, the top of the chain stays in the same height? Really? So why in the world did you drop your chain from 45 meters high in your first video to get a world record of 1.5 meters? You could have just made this 2-meter high pile and the chain would eventually go above 2 meters. Is that too much drama? Yeah, it's for science. Even Steve's fountain peak goes down as the top of his pile goes down, even if the chain was going at a constant speed throughout. You can clearly see it here. Before, after, before, after. So the peak dropping down over time is not an excuse. Steve made a motorized spool to pull the chain at a constant speed and did 2 2D tests on the floor, one with the chains bunched up together and one like mine with chains spaced apart. He says in the tightly bunched up pile, the chain fountain rises and stays high because the chain pushes against the pile to rise, unlike in the spaced out test where the peak is dropping. No, Steve, your bunched up pile fountain is also dropping, but at a smaller rate because the chains are much closer and the pile is receding at a much smaller rate. And what did I say? The fountain starts from stationary to go around. So let's align the 2 tests where the stationary chain just starts going. Look at this. In my spaced out method, the loop gets even taller, perhaps because there is less banging and tangling in the pile. And it indicates no lever push against the pile is needed for the loop to get tall. Well, thank you, Steve, for doing this comparative test because it's pretty much confirming my idea. Sorry, Steve. Like I said, the drama is just to get people invested in science. And then he does another test, creating a lip for the chain to go around, showing in my method the chain never rises above the lip. Really, Steve? If at a constant speed a certain peak height is achieved, you can't put the lip above it and expect the chain to go beyond that. Here's the bunched up pile but far away from the lip. See? You get the same result as Steve's spaced out version because the lip is too far away from the pile. Another thing, in my video I provided a chain with string and spaced out balls to eliminate the lever effect but still create the mold effect. And I argued my peak is going down because clearly the chain is slowing down due to the backward forces. Steve did the same test from a higher drop, and although his chain was still speeding up, his peak dropped. So he argued I'm full of shit. Well, he didn't say that, he's too nice. But he said, due to the lack of the lever effect, the fountain collapses under gravity. Well, I don't buy that. Although on my side, the slowing chain helped lower the peak, there were other factors that contributed. See, in our test, the chain is spaced out in the pile, sitting on a surface like this, and is falling from the edge. But as the chain unwinds, for the chain to travel the same distance through the loop, the peak has to drop. Another thing I mentioned earlier was the chain wants to shoot toward the direction it can consistently escape from, which in this case is that way. So this peak was momentary to start with because I whipped the chain and not the steady state. And not only that, when the chain is being pulled sideways, it drags across the surface and the friction eats away its energy. Which means, considering all these, even with the proper ball chain in that specific setup, we can't really maintain the fountain. So we can't really convince ourselves one way or the other. But if there was one thing the test on my side confirmed, was that the chain slowed down in the presence of opposing forces due to accelerations, like I talked about. So paint me unconvinced by Steve's arguments. Although I can't 100% deny that lever force. Maybe a tiny bit of lever force exists that puts just enough energy into the system over time to help raise the chain. But just based on the 2D floor test Steve kindly provided, no leverage is required to help the chain rise higher. And maybe the lever effect actually makes it worse. The problem is, it is very hard to come up with a good test setup to confirm things one way or the other. But let me introduce you to a magnificent test done by Peter Steinkamp, a medical researcher at Oregon Health and Science University, which further indicates that mechanical engineering degree is a joke. Sorry, just that in my previous job, it was me against like 20 other mechanical engineers. Lest we forget. He has a plastic ball chain with strings connecting the balls, so no limited bend as Steve showed. And he puts them on a rod back and forth like a curtain and he drops the chain. Isn't that beautiful? The chain is super flexible, so no lever effect, and it is not pushing against any surface, and yet it rises upwards as the chain can consistently escape that way. Let's see if I can repeat it with my chain here. So why in the world is the chain rising now? Steve argued in one of his emails that it is a force from the surface of the pipe pushing the chain up. Sure, the chain is pushing against the pipe and so the pipe is pushing back. But this force is perpendicular to the motion of the chain and it's not like it's pulling it up, and the chain is rising even before it reaches the surface. In my mind, this is a very definitive test, and yet I can't confirm or deny things beyond the shadow of doubt. Frankly, as you might have also noticed, I saw the effect of this backward push against the pile or the surface here and there. But then again, it didn't seem necessary for the fountain effect based on some other tests. Anyway, I love these kind of challenging puzzles and had tons of fun arguing with Steve on this. Make sure to subscribe to his channel because he may come back with an even more convincing rebuttal.